What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be breaking down every faction in Warhammer 40k based on its complexity level. Now, this is not a comparison of power level. The factions that are simpler to play are not necessarily more powerful than the factions that are more complex. In fact, many times the more complex factions tend to have more power behind them, but it is harder to unlock. And in many cases, the factions that are simple to play are that way because of the simplicity of their mechanics, not necessarily because they are particularly strong in and of themselves. Now, I'm going to be grading this on a gradient, starting with the simplest factions in the game. My first pick here is Chaos Knights. These guys are relatively resilient. They take a ton of vehicles with high toughness that some armies simply can't answer. And they're incredibly fast, and with the Knights of Shade stratagem, able to move through solid objects, meaning it's easy to reposition your army around the table. They also only use a handful of different profiles, making it easy to remember what each unit's capabilities are. They're relatively forgiving and have a high objective control value, making them very good at both holding and taking enemy objectives, and can even take other Chaos allies like Chaos Demons to help shore up the weaknesses that the faction might have naturally. Next up, we have Necrons. Necrons, as kind of the resilience powerhouse of the 40k game, are naturally going to be fairly forgiving for new players to pick up. They tend to be very difficult to kill and able to heal themselves, and if your opponent is not able to kill your entire unit, they can slowly come back to life over the course of the game. While they don't tend to be particularly fast, they do have lots of good access to beasts, infantry units that can move through walls, and repositional effects that let them teleport around the table, making it not too difficult for them to get where they need to. For the most part, that level of resilience is what makes Necrons strong. They have lots of damage reduction effects, strong and vulnerable saves, backed up by feel no pains that can make them survive even in instances where your opponent's concerted efforts would normally kill them. Now, moving on to a faction that denotes a little bit more flexibility, we have Space Marines. These guys are constructed from the get-go as kind of the new player experience army, and as such, they are incredibly flexible, able to play whichever variety that the player sees fit, whether they want to play a more aggressive melee-oriented focus or a more passive ranged army. They have detachment options for all of those, and they have a lot of get-out-of-jail-free mechanics within those detachments. Most Space Marine armies have ways to leave combat and still fight. They all have ways to buff their own resilience, making them survive in situations where you wouldn't normally expect them to. And given that they can perform fairly well in basically any phase of the game, you almost always have something to do with the Space Marine army. It's hard to find a way to play Space Marines incorrectly. Now, Space Marines are broken into several different sub-factions. I'm going to be rolling in the Codex-compliant chapters, those being Salamanders, Ultramarines, White Scars, Raven Guard, Iron Hands, and Imperial Fists in with this slot because they don't really differentiate very much from the Space Marines proper. However, the non-compliant chapters that have their own supplements I will be ranking specifically, and the next one in the list is going to be Dark Angels. These guys mostly play like normal Space Marines. They do have access to some faster units, but they have a focus on resilience and command point generation, which just sort of flows along with the normal Space Marine strengths. You do have a little bit more to remember, given that the faction has unique units and detachment abilities, but in the worst case scenario, you can just use the normal Space Marine detachments that are very new player centric and simply make your army a little bit more diverse by including some of the Dark Angels' unique units. Next up, we're going to go with Death Guard. These guys are another resilience powerhouse, and unlike Necrons, they don't necessarily have the same level of access to damage reduction or feel no pain style of effects, but most of their effects are passive buffs to their units. They have overlapping offensive auras alongside strong leadership buffs from their characters that make them hard to deal with on the table and inflict massive damage without having to apply too many specific combos to their units. One of the toughest parts about Death Guard is maneuvering with their relatively slow movement speed. They can make up for that a little bit with some faster vehicles as well as their deep strikes, and remembering the offensive contagions that you're inflicting upon your opponent. But once they're set up, they can punish enemies for engaging them too quickly and are good both in shooting and in melee. Moving forward, we have Leagues of Votan. These guys are another fairly well-rounded army with solid resilience. The other benefit that Leagues of Votan have is that they are relatively fast. They have lots of access to forward operators and fast units that can get them where they need to on the tabletop. They also have relatively cheap units, so you have a lot of redundancy in your army. The one downside of Leagues of Votan is that they do rely on their judgment tokens, which have to be applied appropriately in order to make the army work as efficiently as you can, but once you know what opponent's units to assign judgment tokens to, the army will just benefit from them passively, and you don't really have to combo together too many additional effects. They mostly just have solid shooting and decent melee options and can work in multiple phases, as well as having some fast options that make them fairly good at holding objectives and maneuvering around the table. Next up, we have Chaos Space Marine. Now, Chaos Space Marines are a more combo-oriented faction, which makes them kind of naturally harder to use than some of the other armies we've talked about so far, but their codex is an incredibly deep toolbox, and like Space Marines, gives them outs for a variety of scenarios. While you do have to keep track of your Dark Pact abilities and know which abilities to strike Dark Pacts for in particular situations, once you have a handle on that, Chaos Space Marines flow fairly easily, with lots of powerful options both in shooting and in melee, and lots of ways to extend their threat range to get them around the table to the places that they need to be. They're also fairly resilient, have good armor saves, and vulnerable saves on many of their units, as well as some defensive stratagems which can keep them alive, and many of their units are simply relatively difficult to kill. They're sort of like Space Marines, but their army ability is a little bit harder to use than the Space Marine O's at the moment. Now, moving on to some other Space Marine chapters, I'm going to talk about Black Templars. These guys are Space Marines, but with a little bit more of a melee focus. And one thing that will become apparent as we move on is that the factions that have a melee focus are going to be slightly harder to play than factions that are more ranged oriented. This is because melee factions really reward strong maneuvering and positioning, and those are some skills that you'll have to learn if you are going to be better at those armies. Black Templars are very melee oriented, and while they back that up with good shooting, you do have to be adept at manipulating the fight phase and charging where you need to in order to see success with them. That said, Black Templars do have strong shooting they can back that up with, and they use a lot of transports, which are naturally fairly good within the Space Marine Codex. Units like Land Raiders, Rhinos, and Impulsors can get your units to where they need to in order to then disembark on a future turn and get stuck in melee. The same is not necessarily the case for the next faction we're going to talk about, that being Space Wolves. Space Wolves are another Space Marine sub-faction, and while they do share many of the same qualities that Space Marines have, they're relatively flexible, can play a variety of game plans, but like Black Templars have a melee focus, a lot of their melee units are either large ground-pounding infantry units or cavalry, all of which are difficult to maneuver around the table effectively. And while they can be incredibly efficient, they are difficult to move, and that makes them slightly harder to use than Black Templars, who will normally just use transports to get the job done. Next up, we have Deathwatch. I'm mostly putting these guys up here because they have some relatively complex units and unique abilities for a Space Marine faction. Their kill teams are combinations of different model types that all share the same armor mark, which means that while they can create really interesting mixed arms units, they oftentimes create units that use a massive variety of different weapon profiles. Their units also tend to be good at both melee and shooting, but setting yourself up to equally use all of their strengths at the same time can be extremely difficult. Since the shooting of Space Marine infantry is often short-ranged, they don't want to be firing at the units that they're then going to engage in melee, so a lot of forethought is required to play the faction. On top of that, focusing on elite Space Marine infantry, and especially heavy infantry, they also tend to be relatively low model count, which further adds to the complexity of the army. Moving on up, we have Adeptus Custodes. Now, Custodes are another faction that I think is oriented towards new players. The downside is, of course, that first of all, they are melee focused and relatively slow, but they can use teleport and some redeployment effects to get themselves into the positions they need to. So you have to be good at deep striking and that portion of the game to get the most out of a Custodes army. They are also very low model count, so if you misuse any of your units, the game is going to be tough for you because you typically only have 4 or 5 really strong units to play with, whereas other armies are playing with dozens. While Custodian models tend to be difficult to kill and fairly forgiving in that way, concerted efforts can remove them, and if you misposition them, can be punished fairly harshly. Moving up, we have the Tau Empire. Now, Tau are the game's preeminent shooting faction. They're incredibly good at long-range combat, which makes them, in some cases, slightly simpler to play than a more melee-oriented army. That said, Tau have almost no melee of their own to speak of, meaning that the paradigm almost gets reversed. They are very good at shooting, and as long as you are good at manipulating the shooting phase, remembering your spotting and your target priority, you should be okay with the faction. However, if they get stuck in melee or pushed out of the central objectives, things go really poorly for them. So you do need to have a good grasp of screening, body blocking, and preventing enemy movement in order to succeed with them. At the base level, they can take a bunch of tanks and really high efficiency shooting and be fairly good by themselves, but they really excel once you've mastered the movement phase. Similarly, Blood Angels are melee focused and focused on very fast infantry units. These guys are incredibly hard-hitting in melee, and while they do a little bit of shooting, they are mostly going to be focused on that fight phase. You need to be good at setting up units for future charges, getting yourselves into position to engage enemies, and getting your melee units in combat with the correct enemies they have good profile matchups against. While Blood Angels can be straightforward once you've mastered these techniques, and getting a bunch of jump pack infantry stuck into the heart of your opponent's army can be incredibly rewarding, it will certainly take a little bit of practice before you get a handle on it. Next up, we're going to talk about Imperial Knights. Now, Imperial Knights are very similar to Chaos Knights in that they bring a few highly resilient bodies to the table, usually playing a limited number of data sheets. The difference is that Imperial Knights have a much harder time maneuvering around terrain. Unlike Chaos Knights, they can't move through solid objects using Knights of Shade, meaning that movement and positioning of your models is absolutely crucial. Imperial Knights will oftentimes play less models as well. They'll usually only play a few of the larger classifications of Knights, and that makes it absolutely crucial to use those Knights effectively. It's kind of the same problem that we talked about with Custodes, where the army can potentially be mispositioned and potentially even lose you the game because of that, except even worse, since you only have a handful of individual models on the table, and leaving one exposed and open to your opponent's attack can lose you 400 or 500 point individual models at a time. Once you're comfortable with the faction, however, stomping your opponent over with Knights is incredibly satisfying, but it is always going to be a relatively difficult battle because you always have to be cognizant of where those Knights are standing. Next up, we have World Eaters. These guys are all melee, all the time, forever. All they want to do is get up in their opponent's grill and charge, and while that might seem relatively straightforward, as we talked about with Blood Angels and some of the other Space Marine factions, the fight phase might be the most difficult phase in Warhammer 40k to master. Knowing when to engage with your opponent, knowing what units you want to engage what with, and not overextending yourself and opening yourself up to a strong counterattack are crucial to know when playing with World Eaters. Once you've set yourself up in a good position to attack your opponent, the army runs itself relatively well. You just charge straight forward and try to kill people, but if you mess up the staging phase before you get your units into melee, things can go very poorly for you, and World Eaters' armies are liable to get shot off the table very quickly. Next up, we have Tyranids. They don't hit particularly hard, but they are incredibly good at taking objectives and move blocking enemies. However, in order to get the best use of their abilities, they have to be comboed together in particular ways. And given that many of the most powerful units in the Codex are relatively slow, you have to be able to set up in positions where you can punish enemies for moving forward and engaging you. While they can be difficult to kill, concerted enemy attacks will still remove them, and because Tyranid armies are not typically doing tons of damage in response to their opponent, they need to be able to ride out that early game advantage into a late game win, which requires them to score tons and tons of points. If you are good at maneuvering and scoring points with them, they will reward you, but they are always playing on a knife's edge. And if they lose too many models too quickly, or their opponent has the correct profiles to deal with their larger monsters, things can go south very quickly. And speaking of shooting people off the table, the next faction I have on the tier list here is Astra Militarum. Astra Militarum are similar to Tau in that they have very few melee attacks to speak of, but they do have really good access to lots of infantry and specialist units that can screen out their longer range artillery and guns and make themselves harder to attack. They also have lots of heavily armored tanks that are very difficult to kill and will oftentimes survive even concerted enemy efforts to remove them. This seems like it would make them fairly easy to play, especially being a ranged focus army with lots of artillery that you don't even need line of sight to fire. However, the downside for these units are their faction mechanics. The Militarum army is based around orders that are issued by officer models at the beginning of your turn, and you really need to pay attention to where your units are moving every turn in order to consistently be buffed by those officers. It is also possible to lose your officers since they're normally relatively weak infantry units or even contained within your battle tanks, which your opponent is going to be trying to attack. So using their army rule correctly and selecting which orders to issue at any one time can actually be very difficult and time consuming. And it is really easy to mess up the chain of command and prevent your units from receiving orders that would normally allow them to accomplish the objectives that you need to on the table. Now moving on, we have Adeptus Sororitas. These are relatively resilient with almost army-wide invulnerable saves and strong armor saves, as well as their miracle dice mechanic, which can keep their models alive even after your opponent thought that they would knock them out. That said, Adeptus Sororitas don't necessarily have the same level of damage output that factions like Astra Militarum have, so you have to combo together your effects, characters, and miracle dice in order to deal damage to your opponent. They can do insane damage once their combos are enacted, but you have to be in a position to be able to do so. so. And setting that up is the mark of a good Adeptus Sororitas player. This is another faction where the low toughness of your units makes it relatively easy to lose lots and lots of models very quickly, so if you misposition them, you can get punished for it, but if you're able to use all of their abilities together alongside their army rule, they get incredibly powerful. Moving on, we have Orcs. Now this might sound a little silly since Orcs seem like they're one of the easiest armies in the game to play. However, being an almost entirely melee-focused faction, they suffer many of the same downsides that other factions run into. You have to be good at navigating both the movement and the fight phase and dodging enemy attacks. And on top of that, Orcs faction mechanic oftentimes also requires them to plan out their round ahead of time. And if you're going second, requires a good insight into the current game state. While Orcs can be absolutely unstoppable in the hands of a good player who is good at manipulating the fight phase and knows when to attack, Orcs can also be picked apart by a good player, using movement blocks and suppression effects, as well as trying to bait out use of their Wa early in order to take the army apart. Moving on, we have Eldari. These guys are kind of the poster children for a high skill cap army. That is to say, one that is extremely strong once you learn how to use it. Eldari use relatively light infantry that's easy to kill and have a similar army mechanic to Adeptus Sororitas, albeit with an even more limited selection of dice. They are ridiculously maneuverable and incredible at scoring objectives, which means that if you know how to maneuver with them, you can be very effective. However, you do need to be very careful with your units, since they will die extremely quickly, and if you leave them out in the open, things can go very poorly for you. While Eldar weapons on the whole don't look particularly impressive, when comboed with their psychic effects and detachment rules alongside their Strands of Fate dice, they can do ridiculous damage even when your opponent wasn't expecting it. However, you have to be practiced with use of your army, and you have to know how much damage to expect from each of your units in order to not overcommit into killing enemies, or undercommit and allowing those enemies to retaliate against you, which can be disastrous for an Eldar player. You also have a lot of reactive effects and responsive movements, but you have to set up into a position where you're going to be able to use it effectively. Moving on, we have a similar faction, Adeptus Mechanicus. Now, Adeptus Mechanicus are okay at dealing damage, but generally speaking are relatively underpowered when it comes to their damage output. However, they are numerically superior and have a reasonable amount of mobility. This allows them to field tons of units and can be relatively resilient, but they have to use those units to contain enemy aggression. If you get stuck into an Adeptus Mechanicus army too early and start killing them in melee, things are going to go really poorly for them very quickly. This makes knowledge of movement blocking at the movement phase and maximizing what mediocre attacks they can bring to bear on a target incredibly crucial to play Adeptus Mechanicus well. And this is a faction that is relatively easy to fall apart with if you lose too many of your lighter units too quickly. And that was us onto some of the more complex factions in the game. Next up is Jakari. These are a similar faction to Eldari that are relatively light and easy to kill, but very fast and can combo together some solid damage. Jakari also focus on transport, so you also need a good grasp of the transport mechanics, and their units tend to be physically very large, with big sailboats like Raiders and Ravagers alongside their relatively wide Venoms that are big units for their pretty weak defensive stat line. This can make Jakari easy to kill, but if you position yourself in positions where you can disembark your passengers into advantageous positions on the table, you can still get value out of those transports even if your opponent is killing them. This takes the maneuverability and complexity of Eldari and turns it up to 11. Also having to keep track of where your transports are going, where your units can disembark, and how you can disembark into positions where you can most effectively use them on future turns. And that moves us on to Chaos Demons. Now, Chaos Demons are wildly maneuverable, like most of the armies that we're going to be talking about in this top tier of complexity. Chaos Demons have lots of deep strike, reinforcement, and repositional effects that allow them to enter the warp and then arrive back from it. That can make planning ahead with them difficult, and keeping track of their Shadow of Chaos army mechanic can add an additional layer of stress when playing them. They also boast basically 40k's worst armor saving throws, given that basically every demon relies on invulnerable save versus armor saves, which means that they don't benefit from cover almost ever, which makes them fairly easy to kill. Demons don't really want to be in the line of fire very often, but are close range and melee focused. They can access enemy units with those close range weapons by deep striking, but you have to be able to play around opponents' screens and anti-deep strike mechanics. While their big greater demons and monsters are more resilient and harder hitting than some of the other factions we're about to talk about here, getting those greater demons engaged with what they want to attack adds some complexity to the faction. Thousand Sons is the next one on the list, and these guys are here mostly just for the the complexity of their army mechanic. Cabalistic Rituals gives them a pool of additional resources that they can use over the course of the battle round on special abilities, and knowing where and when to use those abilities adds essentially an extra phase worth of work to the Thousand Sons army. While they can do absolutely ludicrous damage once you're close to them, that requires you to be in short range, and getting relatively fragile Thousand Sons units into those locations can be sometimes difficult without getting them shot to death. Once they're there, they do some of the most insane damage in 40k, but it requires a lot of additional thinking to get them there safely. Next up, we have Grey Knights. Grey Knights have a basically similar game plan to the other factions that we talked about in this tier. While they have mediocre damage output, they are wildly maneuverable, similar to Chaos Demons, but they don't have to pay any CP to teleport themselves around the table. That makes the army probably the most maneuverable in 40k, and when combined with reactive movements, they're very difficult to play against. But that also requires that you have a head on your shoulders good enough to play with them. And comboed with the fact that the army oftentimes struggles to kill high toughness enemy units, where you can run into situations where Grey Knights are very effective on the table, but oftentimes win without actually attacking their opponent. It definitely takes a unique mindset and some reps with the faction in order to accomplish this, which is why Grey Knights are near the top of this list. And last but certainly not least, for complexity, we're going to have Genestealer Cults. This faction brings a lot of the complexity of a faction like Grey Knights or Chaos Demons that uses lots of deep strike effects and repositions to move their army around the table, but on top of that also brings the added complexity of playing an enormous horde. Genestealer Cult armies will play hundreds of models and require you to not only open up space on the table to set up those models without being deep strike screened, but also put them in positions where they can effectively use their ranged attacks. Now, unlike many other factions like Tau Empire or Astra Militarum, for example, these ranged attacks come from little individual infantry models rather than larger tanks or vehicles. The reason that this makes things difficult is that losing line of sight with individual models or units is actually fairly easy, if you're not just relying on the massive hulls of huge tanks to draw your line of sight from. This can make it logistically very difficult to get all of the Genestealer Cultists that you need in range on a single target, and you need almost pinpoint perfect positioning in order to get value out of those units. Once they're on the table as well, Genestealer Cultists tend to be incredibly easy to kill, so your army disappears very quickly once it's deployed. They do have the ability to respawn, but they only respawn in predetermined areas of the table. When a unit's destroyed, it's replaced by a cult ambush token that they then respawn from, which can be destroyed by enemy units, and they respawn at the end of an enemy movement phase, meaning that in order to get effective use out of those respawning units, you have to place them in positions where your opponent can't attack them, and they can then move to re-engage on the future turn. That's a ton to think about even when you're accepting attacks and losing models, and given that the army doesn't hit particularly hard in melee and really has no way to dig themselves out of a close range fight, you have to be incredibly good at doing it, because if you fail to do damage with your deep strikes on the turn that your units arrive, things can go very, very poorly for you. That said, Genestealer Cults can deliver absolutely punishing alpha strikes once all of their abilities are in place, but it does require incredibly strong play from the Genestealer Cult player in order to make the faction hum. And with that, that's every faction in 40k ranked by complexity. Let me know down in the comment section if you agree with my tier list and if you would put any of these in other categories. This ranking is fairly subjective, and some playstyles may simply speak more easily to some players who have an easier time adopting them. But anyway, thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.